Greetings and welcome back, gentles and ladiesmen, to another installment of the comprehensive Klonoa Marathon. I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and today we're going to be talking about the last portable game in the series, Klonoa Heroes Legendary Star Medal for the Game Boy Advance. This Japanese-only action RPG was released for the GBA in 2002, and has something of a cult status among some Klonoa fans. Does this game deserve this following? Or is this spin-off just better left in Japan? Let's find out. So if you've been following me for a while, you might have noticed that Klonoa Heroes is the first RPG I've reviewed for the channel, and there's a reason for that. Now please don't kill me when I say this, but I generally don't like RPGs all that much. That's not to say that there aren't some RPGs that I really like, with Paper Mario for the N64 being one of my favorite games of all time. When it comes to the more mainstream games of the genre, however, there's a number of design choices, such as the copious amounts of grinding or lack of interesting things to do in the overworld, that I really just don't care for. There are certainly many things I do like about RPGs, namely the world building, the characters, and the overall storytelling. But when it comes to gameplay, very few traditional RPGs have managed to keep me entertained long enough to actually finish them. To be clear, this is not a knock against people who enjoy RPGs, traditional or otherwise. For the most part, I'm willing to accept that the genre just isn't my thing, and that's entirely a matter of my own personal taste. If you love the genre and everything that comes with it, please don't stop on my account. Just don't hold your breath for any Final Fantasy roars. That being said, I can generally get more into action RPGs such as Kingdom Hearts than I can traditional ones, largely because the direct control over your character allows for more skill and strategy than you can get with an interface GUI. Nevertheless, I still had no idea what to expect coming into Klonoa Heroes. At first glance, a Klonoa action RPG seems somewhat antithetical to the puzzle platforming gameplay that characterizes most of the series. But then again, you wouldn't think that Mario could succeed as an RPG, and those are among the only RPGs that I actually like. Naturally, there's going to be at least some give and take to make the genre transition work, so ultimately I'm most interested in how well Klonoa Heroes accomplishes what it sets out to do. Like most previous entries in the series, I wasn't able to dig up much about Klonoa Heroes' development history, so we can only speculate as to why Namco made the decision to make an action RPG game out of the Klonoa IP. From what I can gather, this game was developed by Klonoa Works itself and directed by Toshiyuki Nakanishi, and series creator Hideo Yoshizawa seems to have had nothing to do with its production whatsoever. Perhaps after finishing their work on Lunatea's Veil, Klonoa Works thought that Klonoa might enjoy more success if he branched out into other genres. In any case, the game hit Japanese shelves in December of 2002 under the title of Klonoa Heroes Densetsu no Star Medal, which officially translates to Klonoa Heroes Legendary Star Medal. At least, that's what Bandai Namco chose to call the game when they re-released the soundtrack on iTunes in March of 2011. The plot is perhaps one of the best the series has to offer. In order to adequately summarize the story for review purposes, I will have to discuss events taking place a few worlds into the game, so if you'd prefer not to spoil too much for yourself, feel free to skip ahead to this timestamp. Klonoa Heroes is set in an alternate universe version of Lunatea, and appears to have no continuity with any of the previous games. Since Klonoa Heroes was actually the last original Klonoa game to release before the 2008 remake of Door to Phantomile, I'm unsure of whether Klonoa Heroes was intended to reboot the series, or just act as a self-contained spin-off game, but I'm guessing it was probably the latter. We open with Klonoa successfully picking a Hikari Sakura, or Radiant Blossom, which is said to bestow good fortune upon whomever it blooms for. It turns out that one of Klonoa's best friends, a priestess in training named Lolo, is leaving that day to continue her training at the sacred temple in the sky. Klonoa attempts to give her the Radiant Blossom as a goodbye present, but is interrupted when a group of monsters attack Breezegale's sacred Bell Hill. In an effort to impress Lolo and prove himself as a hero in his own right, Klonoa journeys to the hill and takes on a group of giant moos, only to find himself overrun. Just when it seems he might be done for, a bounty hunter named Gantz, or Gunts as he's known in Europe and Japan, arrives and defeats the monsters. When Klonoa tries to thank the Gold Digger for helping him out, he notices that Gunts has a hero medal, a badge of honor carried by those capable of heroic acts. When Klonoa asks the Gold Digger where he can get one of his own, Gunts rebukes Klonoa's dreams as beyond him, and reveals that he was just hunting the monsters for sport before stealing Klonoa's Radiant Blossom as payment for saving his life. Klonoa spends the rest of the day learning a new ability from Baloo the Mason and chasing after Gunts, and after a hard-fought battle, he succeeds in retrieving Lolo's present. Klonoa manages to catch up with Lolo just before she leaves Breezegale, and she happily accepts Klonoa's gift. Klonoa is then approached by Guns, who is impressed with his strength and conviction. He offers Klonoa a chance to partner up with him and take on bounties together. Klonoa, seeing a chance to travel the world and become the hero he's always dreamed of being, takes the job and leaves his native Breezegale behind. After running a few odds and ends, Klonoa and Guns stumble across Jenga, a foul-mouthed treasure hunter against whom Guns desires revenge. Guns gives chase and him and Klonoa are separated. Klonoa, meanwhile, comes across an explosives expert named Pango and teams up with him to save some people trapped in the ruins. The two travel to the temple in the sky to try to cut off Jenga when the evil clown Joka appears and kidnaps Lolo. It's revealed that Jenga and Joka have teamed up with the roboticist Garland, and that the three are hatching a nefarious scheme to harness the power of nightmares for their own fiendish purposes. Eventually uniting as a trio, Klonoa, Guns, and Pango will have to journey to the distant corners of the world and beyond to settle the score with Jenga, rescue Lolo, and defeat the three villains before time runs out. And that, in general, is the plot to Klonoa Heroes Legendary Star Medal. As you can tell from my summary, it takes a while to get going, but other than that, it's pretty damn good. The presentation is similar to that of the previous two handheld games, though not quite as dynamic. Empire of Dreams and Dream Champ Tournament featured cinematic cutscenes with fully rendered characters and backgrounds. Klonoa Heroes, in contrast, uses animated facial portraits and text boxes, and on its own, it works quite well. Characters are still very expressive, with the main trio possessing 1.5 dozen facial portraits apiece. Between the animations and the text box, it's easy enough to visualize what's going on in every cutscene, and it succeeds in keeping me entertained. Occasionally, the game will make use of full-screen visuals similar to that of Moonlight Museum, and while I wish there was more of these, I think the presentation is fine as is. Considering that Klonoa Heroes was an early release GBA game and a cutscene-heavy action RPG at that, this approach to cutscenes makes sense given the hardware limitations. Character and setting-wise, Klonoa Heroes feels almost as though someone threw all the previous games into a blender and hit Frappe. Numerous locations, such as Breezegale, Jugkettle Sea, Volk City, and the Temple in the Sky, reappear from or were inspired by similar locations from Door to Phantom Isle and Lunatea's Vale. Similarly, most of the characters from the previous games see an incarnation here, including Baloo the Mason, Chipple the Kangaroo, Popka, or is it just Popka, Joka, Garland, and even that big ape-like guy from Dream Champ Tournament. For that reason, fans of the previous games, such as myself, will probably enjoy seeing their favorite characters again in Klonoa Heroes, even if most of them appear only briefly. The villains are great as well, in what is possibly their greatest appearance. They maintain the same goofy charm they possessed in the previous games while also being fairly intimidating. Our main trio, however, is what really pulls it all together. Gantz, or Guns, who is great as Klonoa's rival in Dream Champ Tournament, makes for an interesting protagonist. On one hand, he's obsessed with money, and his callous disregard for others can be downright appalling sometimes. On the other hand, he can develop sincere friendships with people he trusts and is a skilled tactician. Ultimately, the game follows Guns as he faces the demons of his past and learns to value teamwork and friendship. As for Pango, the new player character introduced for this game, he was surprisingly endearing. Pango's son, Boris, has fallen victim to a sleeping disease, and so Pango wanders the world in search of a cure. Just when Klonoa begins to question Guns' credentials as a hero, Pango takes Klonoa under his wing to teach him the true meaning of heroism. Later in the game, when Klonoa is at his lowest point, Pango helps Klonoa to puff out his chest and keep moving forward, no matter what. As for Klonoa himself, this is probably his best appearance. This Klonoa seems a lot younger and more impressionable than the Klonoa from the main series. He's still learning his lot in life, but he's courageous and will do anything to help those in need. Ultimately, Klonoa Heroes explores what it means to be a hero, and questions some of the stuff we take for granted about the archetype. Over the course of the game, Klonoa and company discover what it really means to be strong, and for what purpose, and it's an interesting theme for a video game. Overall, it's a well-written, well-presented plot with a menagerie of great settings and likable characters. Ultimately, though, I still think Lunatea's Vale had the better plot. I thought that the character arcs were stronger and that the themes and message were more interesting. Still, Klonoa Heroes is definitely up there. That being said, it's kind of a shame that Legendary Star Medal was never released outside of Japan, because unless you can read hiragana, then everything's gonna go right over your head. I was able to get the full experience by reading an English translation online, and while all of those are works in progress, I was still sucked into the plot and invested in what would happen next. If a story is so compelling that it transcends a language barrier, then it's gotta have something going for it. As for the aesthetics, Klonoa Heroes is something of a mixed bag. Visually, I think Klonoa Heroes is the best looking Klonoa game on the GBA. Nothing against Dream Champ Tournament or even Empire of Dreams, but the sprite work, environments, and effects just seem better drawn and better animated in general. Also, for a Game Boy Advance game, the graphics are surprisingly detailed and the colors surprisingly bold. Compare that to some of the assets from the previous games, which occasionally look blocky, washed out, or just pixelated. Graphically, Klonoa Heroes holds up well and I have no complaints. The music, on the other hand, leaves something to be desired. It's kind of a Star Fox 64 scenario where the melodies and tunes are great, but the instrumentation isn't there to back it up. Empire of Dreams and Dream Champ Tournament had a few 8-bit sounding instruments here and there, but the developers still made an effort to make use of the GBA sound capabilities. The soundtrack to Klonoa Heroes, for the most part, sounds like something you'd hear on the Game Boy Color, and you'll have to excuse me for thinking the GBA is capable of better. Given the GBA's reputation sound-wise, many people might actually prefer it this way, but as for me, I feel like they could have tried a little harder. There's no way that the graphics and game logic were so intensive on the CPU that this was the best they could do. The developers were just lazy. Now, that being said, the melodies are much better than Moonlight Museum's, which were mostly just scrambles of 8-bit arsenic. My favorites include Gunsa's theme, the remake of Volk City's theme, and the theme of Jug Kettle Sea. The game's main theme, Sign of Hero, also features a vocal track from Klonoa's voice actor, Kumiko Watanabe, and is easily my favorite track in the entire game. My only complaint, besides the instrument quality, is that the level themes can get awfully repetitive after a while, but let's put a pin on that one for later. Overall, the music's decent, but I still think it could have been a lot better. And that brings us to the meat of the review, the gameplay. Klonoa Heroes is probably best described as a dungeon crawler with some RPG elements thrown in for good measure. The closest thing I can compare it to gameplay-wise that I've played is Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, but even that's a cautious comparison at best. Essentially, Klonoa, Guns, and Pango will have to make their way through 7 worlds and a final boss battle to finish the game. Similar to previous Klonoa games, dungeons are referred to as visions, of which there can be as many as 6 or as few as 3 depending on the world. Sometimes your characters will tackle dungeons separately, but this doesn't happen too often. The objective of each vision is to make it through all the rooms to proceed to the end of the dungeon, while fighting enemies and collecting keys to open gates along the way. Similar to Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, visions in Klonoa Heroes use a linear room-to-room design and span an indeterminate number of floors. Unlike that game, the dungeons in Klonoa Heroes aren't randomly generated, which I much prefer. Every once in a while, you'll put on the dive suit from Dream Champ Tournament to go into places where there's no air. Honestly, I don't really like these sections that much, thanks to the slippery controls and the wonky hitbox. Thankfully, there are only a handful of these visions in the whole game. Those clamoring for the series' trademark puzzle elements will only find them in a handful of puzzle sections, where you have to sneak around these guru enemies and collect keys. If you walk into their line of sight, they'll instantly charge into you and you'll have to restart the room. The problem with these levels is that your visibility is so limited that you can never see all the gurus at once, so inevitably you're gonna get hit and have to restart. That is, until you memorize the enemy placement through trial and error. The earlier guru sections are harmless, but the later ones just kind of get in the way. It's kind of a shame that the most traditional parts of Klonoa Heroes just feel out of place and don't really add that much. Between dungeons, you'll visit towns, talk to NPCs, buy items, armor, or weapons, and sleep at inns to restore your health or cure status ailments. There's some points in the game where you won't be allowed to proceed to the next vision until you go into town and speak with the inhabitants, who ostensibly tip you off as to where to go next. Assuming you can read the dialogue, I'm sure these townsfolk offer plenty of great gameplay advice, tips for dungeons, and help with world building. Unfortunately, since I can't read Japanese and there are no translations for these areas available online, they just came off as filler to me. At the end of every world, you'll fight a boss, wrap up the story arc for that world, and move on to the next one. Klonoa Heroes is much more combat-focused than previous games, as you might expect from an action RPG. All the familiar mechanics, such as platforming and inflating enemies for use as projectiles, have been stripped away in favor of a new combat system. All the characters have a red attack and a blue attack. both of which are only effective against certain types of enemies. You'll also unlock special attacks as the story progresses, which are required to take on certain enemies. By defeating enemies, you earn money and experience crystals, which you use to buy items and level up your characters respectively. Klonoa Heroes employs a unique level up system based on these ability slots. Essentially, depending on the weapon or armor you've picked, you'll get a certain number of these slots along 4 stats, and every time you level up, you'll earn points to fill up the slots. One great feature is that you're allowed to reconfigure your customized points to whichever stat you want every time you finish a rune, which allows you to change them up to fit the situation. Now, Moonlight Museum was a Japanese-only game as well, but I really don't think the experience is hampered in any way from not being able to read the language. Klonoa Heroes is a bit of a different story. If you can't read hiragana, then trying to navigate the regular game menus can be a big hassle. Eventually you'll memorize where everything is and start to associate vague Japanese shapes with certain menu items, but in the meantime you're probably gonna get confused and do things you don't want to do by accident. On top of that, there are a number of important gameplay details that the game probably explains, but you'd still never know about because you can't read the language. For example, I went through the entire game thinking that Guntz was by far the worst character due to how cumbersome it is to consistently line up his shots without a strafe feature. But right as I'm editing this review, I learned from a brand new guide that came out a week ago that Guntz actually could strafe the whole time. Just hold down the L button while moving and suddenly he's a hell of a lot more useful. I thought the whole time that the L button was just for switching characters, and I never happened to hold down L and move as Guntz by accident. Klonoa Heroes has so many little tidbits like this that you'd never know about if you're a Westerner like me. My point is that Legendary Star Medal is by far the least accessible game in the entire series, at least in its current untranslated state. Now, that being said, it's not as bad for Westerners as you might think. Klonoa Heroes still uses symbols, Arabic numerals, and the occasional Greco-Roman letters for shop menus in the interface GUI, so I had an easier time navigating menus than I had anticipated. Still, figuring out what some of these things do is kind of a crapshoot. How could I have guessed, my first time playing, that these flying moo wings warp you back to the world map? That's not really the game's fault, seeing as the intended audience would be able to read the item description, but if you're a Westerner like me, it's worth noting that Klonoa Heroes has a big learning curve to begin with, and the language barrier only adds to this. Difficulty-wise, Klonoa Heroes is easily the toughest game in the series. Dream Champ Tournament had some very tricky puzzles, but even at its hardest you could just look up the solutions online. In Klonoa Heroes, you'll have your work cut out for you if you want to make it to the end of this game, and that's probably a good thing, because if this game were any easier, the repetitive enemies and dungeon design would probably get boring after a while. Because everything keeps you on your toes, it prevents things from getting too bleh. You'll want to keep a full stock of items on you every time you enter a dungeon, especially in the back half of the game, or you're very likely not going to make it. Enemies are aggressive and come in many flavors. In fact, almost every enemy from the console games makes an appearance here. They start off easy, but they get stronger, quicker, and beefier as the game goes on. There's a lot of palette swapping going on here, but the game is still good about introducing enough new elements to keep things from getting too repetitive. Bosses, too, present quite the challenge. Definitely the hardest in the series. Many of them have multiple parts to hit, some can heal themselves, others split into several clones, and others just hit like a truck. And trust me, you really don't want to die against them. If you get knocked off by an enemy, then you get sent back to the beginning of a dungeon and have to trek all the way back to the boss to try again. While you get to keep all the experience and items you found along the way, you'll lose half of your money. If you're at the end of your rope and can't beat the boss, you can always use the Flying Moo's Wing item to warp out of the dungeon. This way you'll keep your money and can restock on items before challenging the boss again. All the gates you've already opened stay opened on subsequent visits, so it doesn't take nearly as long to trek back to the boss. In general, while Klonoa Heroes is a fairly challenging game, for the most part it's well designed and based on skill, which adds to the experience rather than detracting from it. Generally, when it comes to the core gameplay, I think Klonoa Heroes is a solid experience. Fighting enemies, leveling up, upgrading equipment, and exploring dungeons is all fun and rewarding. And I want to make that absolutely clear, because while that's what I think of the game overall, Klonoa Heroes is also bogged down by a number of questionable design choices. So let's have a quick speed round of all these gripes, starting with the nitpicks and working our way up to the more major flaws. Number 1. The combat. In general, it's pretty solid, but I do have some nitpicks. To charge up special attacks, you have to attack enemies over and over until your gauge fills up, which can take forever. And depending on how high your special attack stat is, you might have to use the attack multiple times to actually finish off an enemy, which is just a pace breaker. You can use these yellow items to fill up part of your gauge, but sooner or later, you're gonna run out. I don't understand why the special attacks couldn't just function as screen clearing moves. You know, something to use when you just want to wipe out a group of enemies and move on. As is, they're only really effective against enemies for which they're required. Another nitpick I have concerns the weapons. While all three characters have a number of them to choose from, only a handful of them are actually useful. For example, Klonoa's wind sword weapons are the only ones I can recommend, as they have the most generous hit detection and seem to do the most damage at the fastest rate. In some, the combat works well enough, but I would have changed a few things if I were in charge of development. Number 2, the item system. To use items, you have to scroll through them with select in real time and hit R to use the item itself. This works well enough, but because there's no way to move the selection backwards, you could potentially skip over an item you want and have to cycle through them again just to select it. The game also doesn't pause while you're doing this, so you could potentially be taking hits while trying to select your preferred healing item. Why couldn't select pause the game and open the item menu, and then you can scroll through with the D-pad to equip the item you want, then press R to use it. The same thing goes for switching characters. You have to keep pushing the L button to cycle through your characters until you get the one you want. This works well when you only have 2 to choose from, but when you have all 3, it feels unnecessarily cumbersome, especially since you have to stand in place in order to switch. Why couldn't you hold L, select the character you want with the D-pad, and then let go for the one you want? Again, I consider these minor complaints, far from deal breakers, but still things I would have done differently. Number 3, those dang old mimics. Lots of RPGs have mimic chests, or monsters in a box, where the treasure chests come to life and try to attack you. Recently I played Mega Man Legends 2, which is fantastic by the way, and was surprised at just how many mimics there were. But now that I've played Klonoa Heroes, I can safely say that this game takes the cake. Mimics are so ridiculously common that it seems they make up almost half the chests in the game. The worst part is that they won't aggro until you get right on top of them, so even if you try to avoid them, you're very likely going to take damage anyway. And I've gotta say, that's pretty annoying. Isn't the point of mimic chests is that they're surprises that you don't see coming? So doesn't having so many of them defeat the purpose of including them to begin with? Number 4, the map system, or rather, the lack thereof. Now, I haven't played many dungeon crawlers in my time, but I've generally found that adventure games with more non-linear level design have a map system of some kind. Klonoa Heroes does not, and seeing as the dungeon floors are big and often maze-like, that's kind of a problem. And it's not like the GBA was incapable of having such a thing. Zelda had it, Metroid had it, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon had it, etc. To be fair, the game doesn't require a map system to be playable. It's entirely possible to finish the game without one, but it would have shortened the amount of time spent in dungeons tremendously. I can't tell you how much time I wasted lumbering around dungeons without a clue as to where to go next. If there was a map system, this never would have been an issue. And to those who argue that there's no room on the screen or no buttons available for a map, I point to the giant character portrait that takes up nearly a fourth of the screen. Its only use, as far as I can tell, is for denoting status effects. But that's something that could have been better illustrated by swapping the character's palette anyway. Why couldn't they have used that space for a map system? Why couldn't you just access the map from the pause menu? How about a camera scrolling feature similar to Dream Champ Tournament? Seriously, why isn't there a map system in this game? Number 5. Dungeon length. After playing this game, I almost regret criticizing the stage length in Lunatea's Veil. Stages like the Ishris Arc were pretty long, but even those were maybe 40 minutes at the very, very most. Klonoa Heroes is the kind of game where you can spend over an hour in a stage on a typical playthrough. Now, to be fair, this was because I was taking the time to defeat all the enemies and uncover all the hidden items. I'm sure that if you skip out on all that stuff, the dungeons are significantly shorter. At the same time, however, you're encouraged to defeat all the enemies you can so that your stats are good enough to take on the boss. So if you're skipping a bunch of enemies, you're very likely gonna get your ass kicked. The game also doesn't have the courtesy to tell you how many floors the dungeon has. Why? You could be wandering through a dungeon for over an hour and have no clue how much longer it's gonna go on. I understand that Klonoa Heroes is an RPG, and they wanted to make sure that the game was long enough, but the solution to that problem was to make more shorter levels, not to make increasingly fewer levels that take longer and longer to beat. But by far the game's greatest flaw is number 6, the accuracy stat. I found that for the first half of the game, I was conditioned to upgrade my attack and special stats over everything else. If you don't, then bosses can drag on forever, and it's absurd how much of a difference a single slot in your attack stack can make. This strategy worked well enough. That is, until I reached Volk City. Upon reaching Vision 2, my attack suddenly didn't seem to do any damage. I kept getting this weird squeaking noise with a bunch of Japanese text that I can't read. At first I thought I had to hit the enemies from a specific angle, but the earlier iterations of those same enemies didn't have that condition, and it didn't seem to have any consistency to it. So I elected to do some grinding to prepare for the boss, which is pretty bad on its own. As long as I'm killing every enemy on the way to the boss, I should never have to grind. On a whim, I decided to upgrade my agility stats since I thought it couldn't hurt. And wouldn't you know it, that fixed the problem. Suddenly my attacks were doing a lot more damage and enemies were dropping dead quicker. So I did some poking around on the web, but it turns out that the agility stat is this game's equivalent of the accuracy or evasion stats used in other RPGs. Up to that point, I had thought the agility stat was used to determine walking speed. Couldn't they have called this stat something more familiar so that you know what it does? For all I know, the game does explain this, but since I can't read Japanese, there's no way I'd ever know. Again, that's not necessarily the game's fault, but it's just another reason why it's hard to recommend this game to Westerners. The bigger problem, though, is why this stat is even in the game to begin with. In a traditional interface-based RPG, accuracy and evasion stats help to simulate misses and critical hits to make battling feel more authentic. In Klonoa Heroes, however, there's nothing for these stats to simulate, because you attack enemies directly. So obviously, if your attacks don't connect with an enemy, then that's what a miss looks like. So having an accuracy stat that determines whether your attacks count serves no purpose whatsoever, besides forcing you to grind and drag out the pace of the game. This becomes a pretty consistent problem in the back half of the game, because if your agility stat isn't where the game wants it, it's possible to hit newer enemies up to 5 times and do no damage at all, which is absolutely ludicrous. You can hit an enemy in the face with a bomb, and they'll even recoil backwards from the impact, but because of the agility stat, the game just decides that it missed anyway. Just because most RPGs include a stat like this doesn't mean it's appropriate for an action game. In terms of side quests, there's actually quite a few extra visions, set within a new story taking place after the final boss battle. The levels themselves are remixes of old dungeons with harder enemies thrown in for good measure. They're nothing too special, but at the very least they give you an excuse to max out your stats. The Mammoth House also returns from Lunatea's Veil, this time offering a time attack mode where you take on harder versions of bosses. You can also visit Mammoth's brother, Mammoth, who will give you a bunch of items depending on how many Mammoth dolls you give him. The thing is, though, I don't know what they are or what they do, so I couldn't tell you whether it's worth it or not. As far as I know, that's about all there is in terms of side quests. And that just about covers Klonoa Heroes' Legendary Star Medal for the GBA. I know I've been kind of negative for much of this review, but I really do think that Klonoa Heroes is generally a fun game for what it is. The story is great, the graphics look nice, exploring dungeons is fun, fighting enemies and bosses is rewarding, and the challenge enhances the experience while generally coming from the right places. Unfortunately, the instrumentation sounds subpar even for an early release GBA title, selecting items and characters is cumbersome, dungeons are longer than they should be and lack a sorely needed map feature, and the pace of the game is also bogged down by the inclusion of an obtusely named stat that shouldn't even be there. Klonoa Heroes is far from a perfect game, but I'd still call it a good one. That being said, Legendary Star Medal is not a game I can easily recommend to my fellow Westerners. In its current untranslated state, the story is difficult to grasp without extrinsic resources, the menus can be confusing to navigate, and many important game tips are likely hidden behind a language barrier. On top of that, fans of the main series won't find any familiar elements to latch onto, and depending on how patient you are, you may find you're unwilling to tolerate the game's more questionable design choices. If you're a fan of dungeon crawlers like Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, or just a fan of RPGs in general, I think you'll be better suited to enjoy this game than most people. But if what you've seen from this video hasn't impressed you, I'd recommend steering clear of this one. While that sums up my thoughts on Klonoa Heroes as is, the future of the game is very much up in the air, and you all have a chance to make a difference. Introducing Untamed Heart Klonoa Collective, the world's premier Klonoa fan site and forum. Founded on Zeta boards in 2013, UHKC eventually moved to its own site in 2014, and has since offered a community for Klonoa fans to chat about one of their favorite series. In fact, a user named Vic Van Hazel has been kind enough to share this review marathon with other Klonoa fans, who seem to be really enjoying it so far. Thank you, kind sir. Anyways, I bring up UHKC because in addition to a number of other Klonoa-related fan projects, the site has also been working on an English translation patch for Klonoa Heroes Legendary Star Medal. The work that's been done so far is really impressive, but I've been hearing mixed messages from the developers as to whether the project will continue to completion. Seeing as I found the Japanese dialogue to present a lofty learning curve for Western players, I think the option to play the game in English will greatly increase the game's accessibility and possibly make the game's finer points more intuitive. So it would truly be a shame if a finished patch never came out. For that reason, I compel any Klonoa fans in attendance to go show this project some support, and thank the fine folks at UHKC for making an English Klonoa Heroes a possibility. The good news is that Calm Serenity and Vokaday of UHKC have recently teamed up with a GameFAQs user named Final Sora Riku to compile the forum's translated scripts into one streamlined translation guide that anyone can access. Before this, you had to make an account on the forum to get past the spoiler tags, so now everyone can get the full Klonoa Heroes story experience. On top of the translations, the guide also contains a number of great game tips and explanations for shops, menus, game mechanics, and the like. This was how I learned that Gunts could strafe, as well as what Mammoth does. If you're interested in giving Klonoa Heroes a whirl for yourself, I can't recommend this guide enough. It's not as good as a completed patch would be, but it's got information on just about everything you'd need to make Klonoa Heroes a more accessible experience. If you're a Klonoa fan who's interested in joining a fan community who loves the franchise as much as you do, consider joining the site or following UHKC on Twitter at Klo Collective. I'm sure they'll greatly appreciate your support. And that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on Klonoa Heroes. Join me next time for the final game in the series, 2002's Klonoa Beach Volleyball for the PlayStation 1. We'll also be taking a brief look at Klonoa Dream Traveler of Noctis Soul, the 2012 webcomic, and wrapping up with my final thoughts in the series as a whole. Until then, I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and I hope you all enjoyed the review.
You know the real problem? Like the real one? Everybody thinks it's, oh, you know, plague this, cancer this, starving African children need food. It's always been the moose. From the very beginning. I'm talking way back when. All the original diseases up to the terrorist attack nowadays, it's been those filthy moose the whole time, I swear.
Meow.
I mean, I'm kidding.
Meow.
Or am I?